let's talk about what I read in March. I've done a couple like month-long reading challenges where I film and make a reading vlog of certain themes. Only one of those is currently up. The first one was the 48-hour reading vlog that I did for Becca's Bookopoly-thon. I read 4 books over that weekend, and I'll kind of quickly touch on those. If you want to know more of my thoughts on any of these 4 books, obviously I have a reading vlog up on my channel. The first one I finished was The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. This was a thriller about a woman whose husband cheated on her with her clone. Her and her clone end up having to work together to cover up the murder of her husband. I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. Overall, I feel like this gave me a lot to think about in terms of gender, but I think that it meandered a little bit towards the end. But honestly, like overall, I would absolutely recommend this. I think this was a good read. The second book I finished was 1,000 Pieces of You by Claudia Gray. This was about a girl and a friend of hers who end up jumping timelines in order to be able to track down the person who killed her father. They're using this time travel device that her parents invented. This turned into a love triangle sort of story, which I'm just like not super into. I'm not as into YA as I used to be, and this didn't work for me as much as I would like it to, but I did enjoy the time travel aspects, which is why I picked up the book in the first place. I'd give this 3.5 stars. I think for what it is, this is a good version of that type of story, of the YA love triangle sort of thing. It's just not necessarily my thing. The next book was All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover. I give this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. This is a book about a marriage in trouble. It has a lot to do with infertility, and I thought this was a decent book. I think if you are at all interested in the subject of infertility, I think it handles it with care. I just am not particularly interested in sappy romances, and this got a little sappy near the end. I also think the characters weren't super well fleshed out, but it wasn't a terrible read. I don't regret it. And the last book I finished on that weekend was Sunshine and Bullets by Coralee June, which is for my 50 Shades of Smut vlog, which should be coming, or it should already be up, I think. This is a reverse harem crime story sort of situation. It involves a main character who has multiple love interests who are all involved in the criminal world in one way or another. One is a head of a gang, one is a bounty hunter, one boxes in underground fighting ring, and one of them is a cop, or a federal agent, I think. This book was a bit of a mess. I didn't love the way the story was being told. There was a huge info dump at the beginning, and then there was like these flashbacks that didn't do anything for me. But I do think that it was a good foundation for a series. I am interested in continuing on this series because I did enjoy the character dynamics. I'd give this 3, maybe 3.5 stars. I also took part in Gailey-a-thon, which is a readathon that is focused on clearing some books off your NetGalley shelf. I have a ton of ARCs I haven't read on my NetGalley shelf, so I desperately needed this readathon. I'll link the host and the readathon down below, by the way. I ended up finishing a couple books for this readathon, the first being The Last Resort by Susi Holliday. This book was... So this book felt like it was supposed to be a retelling of And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. It was about a bunch of people who get invited to this mysterious island with the sole idea that they are supposed to experience some sort of luxury resort, and then at the end of the day they were going to get paid, I think. We actually just watched the movie Fantasy Island, the horror movie, I guess, and this book was very much a cross between Fantasy Island and Then There Were None. The book actually name checks And Then There Were None, so clearly it was done on purpose, but this book was so fucking bad. This is probably, at least I hope, this is the worst book I've read all year, or will read all year, because I gave this 1 star and I really hope it doesn't get worse than this. It was so bad. I will say it was kind of a quick read because it's a thriller. It was very easy to keep going because at a certain point you're like, yeah, I want to figure out what the fuck is going on or why any of these people are making these decisions, because none of the decisions they made a lick of sense. They get to this crazy island with the idea that it's supposed to be some sort of luxury vacation essentially, and yet immediately they're like, we're just gonna put these devices in your brain, okay? And they're all like, yeah, okay, that sounds fine. And it just kind of went on from there. Like, people just kept making the dumbest decisions possible. And I thought maybe that at the end, something could save it. But no, the ending was so nonsensical, so ridiculous. The author even pointed out how ridiculous it was. Like, she would have characters being like, well, what? This doesn't make sense. I'm like, that doesn't make it better. The fact that you know it doesn't make sense. It was bad. It was so, so, so bad. Do not waste your time reading this. 1 out of 5. The second book I finished for Neck Readathon was The Project by Courtney Summers. This book was about 2 sisters, one of which ends up in an accident, and from that point on, they kind of go in 2 very separate directions. The one who wasn't in the accident ends up in what her sister assumes is a cult. After many, many years not talking to each other, the younger sister decides to try and investigate this cult, to try and get her sister out of it. And the story kind of takes off from there. I like this book overall, but I do think it fumbled some things. I think that the book was trying to do a lot, and it didn't necessarily always do it well. The most important things to show around cult books is how people get indoctrinated to these types of situations. And that's where this book really failed, is it failed to show like why the one sister would cross over into this sort of situation. The younger sister makes some decisions that don't make any sense either. Like, they don't show how she came to have a complete 180 in this situation. I still enjoyed the book overall. Cult books are always very interesting, and I think that this author did a good job of showing the type of person who ends up in this position of power as the head of the cult, because you really do get to see this head of the cult a lot, and I think that that was one of the strengths this book had. I gave this book 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I bumped it up to a 4 on Goodreads because I do think that a lot of people would enjoy this. A book I previously DNF'd and I decided to finish this month was I Let You Go by Clare Mackintosh. This book is about a 5-year-old boy who dies in a hit and run. It follows 2 separate perspectives. One being the detectives trying to figure out who hit this child, and the other being the woman who is very much missing her child. I previously DNF'd this because I just found it so incredibly boring, and I did figure out pretty quickly what the twist was going to be, but only because I knew there was a big twist coming. That made it easier. Otherwise, I don't think I would have known. But once I figured that out, there was nothing really holding me to the book because I just wasn't enjoying what I was reading, so I put it down. I decided to pick it back up and try it on audiobook, and that allowed me to get through the part I previously stopped at. And I actually really ended up enjoying this book. Well, I shouldn't say enjoying. I really appreciated what this book did. I realized that my favorite types of thrillers are the type that take a look at hard-hitting contemporary type issues. And I think this one did that really, really well. I will say I came away just hating men in general. Like, this was a hard read and it could be very triggering for I think a lot of people. It did not shy away from taking like a look at very harsh subjects. And yeah, I just came away thinking all men were trash. Because not only is there a very dark situation at the forefront of this book, there's also this detective who's just like a shitty midlife crisis sort of dude who wants to like cheat on his wife with his young partner in the detective squad, and I'm just like, ugh. And he's just like fucking up his marriage at every point while you're standing there like screaming at him. But it was all very realistic, and so I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars because I do think it was really well written, even if the beginning was incredibly dull. I finished 2 nonfictions this month, the first being A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. This was kind of part memoir, part essays on colonialism and the Indigenous experience in Canada. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. My problem with this book is less to do with the actual book itself and more to do with me, because I'm just not smart enough to read this book. I'm not versed in the language used about these topics. Like, a lot of times when I listen to a memoir or I read a memoir, it's about just someone's everyday life, whereas this has a lot to do with colonialism and how Native Americans were treated, and just like treaties and laws and policies and stuff that I don't like have to talk about in my everyday life. It's not the type of language that I interact with a lot. So I definitely think that some of it went over my head and that it wasn't as easy to grasp as a lot of other books are for me. I really appreciate hearing someone's experience as growing up Indigenous in Canada, because I think we so often treat our country like it's some sort of ideal, and it is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. The way that Indigenous people have been treated in our country is pretty horrible. Even like growing up in my small town where we had a large Indigenous population, like the amount of racism I've seen is immense. So I definitely think this is a very important work for more people in Canada to read. The other nonfiction I read was The Polygamous Daughter, and that was by LeBaron. For whatever reason, this one didn't work super well for me. Like I said, I've been listening to a lot of memoirs this year, and so some of them are just bound to not stick in my mind as much, and this is one of those ones. This was about a girl who grew up with a polygamist as a father, but not just any polygamist. He was kind of like the head of his church, and he very much had a cult figure-like presence. She had obviously a very complicated home life, and she had like something like 50 plus siblings, and because of this, like, her family was always moving around and she never got to be with her family really. There was something about the writing that I just wasn't connecting to as much. It wasn't sticking in my brain as much. It was very simply told, and for whatever reason it just didn't work for me. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I think if you're interested, of course it's worth listening to. I just didn't do much for me. I finished an audiobook today called Savage Row by Britney King. This was a thriller about a girl who ends up getting stalked by someone she once convicted of rape. She wasn't raped by him, she was just on the jury that convicted him. Now he's out of prison and he's looking to make her life a living hell. Maybe it's because I expect something from the thriller genre, and that is twists of some sort or reveals or something, whereas this book is exactly what I've just said. There are no twists, there are no reveals. It's literally just this guy trying to make her life a living hell. And I think it was interesting. I think they did keep like ratcheting up the stakes to a certain extent, but like, I don't know, I just kept expecting something else to happen and it wasn't. I feel like I can see what the point of the book was. It seemed to be very much about stalking and how little is done for women who are in this sort of situation. How often the police will just kind of like shrug their shoulders and say that there's not much they can do. But I still didn't enjoy the book overall because it just didn't do a lot more than that. So I think I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. I'd maybe give it a 2.5, but unlike anything else I've read really, but not necessarily in a good way, it almost reminded me of an episode of Law & Order or something. Another thing I finished was The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. I had to restart this. I recently picked this up and DNF'd it a while back. I shouldn't say recently. I picked this up and DNF'd this a while back and never got back to it. So I picked it up again, started over, and I'm honestly not sure what to think about it. This was a book about a guy whose dreams come true. And what I mean by that is when he falls asleep and dreams something, that is what will come true, not what he wants to come true necessarily. He starts to do some sort of therapy with a guy who ends up taking control of this habit of his and shaping the world to a point that he thinks is better. I will say I really enjoyed the way that the author was able to really go there. Like, so often I'll hear of a premise and I feel like the author doesn't take full advantage of it, whereas I truly do feel like Ursula K. Le Guin was like, yeah, we're going to make this kind of weird. And I appreciated that if you're gonna have a premise like this, you should do something strange with it, and she went there. But I will say, not necessarily sure I understood all of it. I feel like it kind of lost me in the last 20%. I didn't totally know what was going on. It's not so much I didn't know what was going on, I just didn't feel like it was going anywhere, I guess. And that still felt true once I finished it. It didn't really feel like any sort of satisfying conclusion. Overall, I'd give this a 3 out of 5 stars. I certainly didn't hate it. I don't know what to think about it. And the last thing I'll talk about in this video is Birthright volumes 2 through 7. I believe that this is from the same writer as Nailbiter, and so that's why I picked it up. Unfortunately, I'm not loving it. This is a comic book series about a boy who was kind of stolen away from his family in order to become a hero of this distant fantasy land. A year later, he comes back, but he is no longer that same boy who went missing a year ago because time moves very differently in this fantasy land, so he's now a full-grown man and he's been working to defeat this evil dude in the fantasy land that he's been in. I wanted to love this. The first volume was so fucking confusing. I hated how it was structured, and so I wasn't sure if I was going to continue on, but I liked the premise enough to do so. I found that once I started again on volume 2, it was a lot easier to understand. They seemed to work out whatever kinks I had in volume 1, but they introduced new problems, which were that none of the characters have any backbone. There's no strength in any of their decisions because they constantly flip-flop all over the place. Like every single page they seem to change their mind and make a different decision. And none of it makes any sense, and they just keep like bringing out twists and reveals in ways that make it seem like they didn't have any sort of plan going into this. Like they just seem to be pulling shit out of their ass, and none of it really feels very well thought out. I'm gonna finish it anyways because I think it only has 10 volumes and I've already read 7. Most of them were on Hoopla, so I've just been borrowing them from there. And like once you're in, you're just kind of like, alright, might as well finish this. But yeah, I'm really not enjoying it, and so far I'd give it 2 out of 5 stars. Those are the books I read in March. There was a ton more, but like I said, those will be in some future reading vlogs. I hope you liked this video, and I hope you'll come back in soon. Bye.